And our topic this evening is to replant or to not. Um, so as we move into the season of 2023, let's see if there was a question, make sure everybody. Yes, I will post that link towards the end of the evening. Um, so the topic today is to replant or not. As we initiate or start the warm season of 2023, following drought in 2022, along with high fertilizer prices, I anticipate a lot of folks seeing a decline or decrease in the persistence or productivity of their warm season perennial pastures and hay meadows. And it's always very challenging to decide how to move forward following some stressful events for our warm season perennials and maybe following some mismanagement or poor management due to weather conditions or having to make economic decisions. Or it's possible that like maybe we've inherited or we've purchased some property that has some forage production or has some viable forage, whether that's Bermudagrass or Bahiagrass, but we feel like it's not as productive, or maybe there's a lot of weed pressure and we're just not sure how to approach it and how to renovate or how to make that pasture new and productive again. And so it's already been a common question from producers. You know, these are the decisions that I made last year because of drought or high fertilizer prices. How do I approach the season of 2023? And so we're going to address some of those questions and some of those recommendations, and we'll talk about whether to replant or not, what renovation means. A lot of people tend to think that renovation means disking or plowing or using some form of element to try to improve or boost their Bermudagrass or their warm season perennial production. So anytime we think we need to renovate or thinking about maybe we need to replant is based on seeing a decline or a reduction in production and persistence of our warm season perennials. And so for most of us in Central and East Texas, most of our warm season perennials are going to be those introduced forages such as Bermudagrass or Bahiagrass. So this topic is going to be much more targeted on those introduced forages, whether it's sprig Bermudagrass, seeded Bermudagrass, what have you. So decline it's kind of a broad term, and it's a problem that's often linked with several causes. So a multitude of problems that have potentially built up over time, over a number of years, over consistent poor management, along with poor weather conditions. Now, some of that, we may inherit that piece of property or purchase that piece of property that has been mismanaged or poorly managed for several years. And then we're having to make the decision on how to move forward, how to turn that into a productive pasture or a productive hay meadow. So typically, a lot of times, I guess as humans, it's our nature is we want to blame one thing or one person or one issue instead of look at, potentially a multitude of problems. And so it's typically several factors that occur simultaneously or that have built up over time. They've kind of compounded or accumulated over time. And we often tend to see this decline exacerbated as a result of drought. The drought may have been the final nail in the coffin versus the actual cause. So it could have just been the final blow that had showed a great impact on those warm season perennials, but it was potentially because of overgrazing those pastures for a number of years. Even during good growing conditions, or not fertilizing when we have adequate rainfall or when fertilizer prices are high. And I realize we do have to make decisions based on economics, based on our resources, but a lot of those decisions can have an impact down the road on the persistence and the production of those warm season perennials. So the usual suspects of what factors can occur that can lead to decline, whether it's the singular suspect or the combination. For a lot of us in Central and East Texas, we utilize cool season forages for winter forage, and that's something that I promote and recommend. If you have the ability to utilize that forage for grazing or even for harvesting, forages such as annual ryegrass, cool season annual legumes, small grains. They are great forages, that high quality forages that we can utilize. We can overseed into an existing warm season perennial stand. However, they can provide competition on those warm season perennials, especially during that transition period, as those warm season perennials are trying to break dormancy and start actively growing. And that often happens around this time of year. Our warm seasons, such as ryegrass and our legumes, are primarily spring forage producers, meaning that a majority of their forage production occurs in the spring, from February on into March and even April. And when we have good moisture and cooler temperatures, those forages can even stick around into June. And we've seen that happen in East Texas, where warm season perennials don't start actively growing until June. That has happened in the most recent years. Even if they break dormancy in February, they may not start actively growing until later in the summer, late spring, early summer kind of time period. But because those cool season forages are actively growing during that transition period, they can outcompete those warm season perennials for sunlight, for space, for moisture, and even for nutrients. So it's very important that if we've overseeded our warm season perennial sods with these cool season forages, that we actively manage them. That means that we're able to graze them down, reduce their productivity, or we're able to harvest them or to control them with a herbicide, so that those warm season perennials can start to grow and start to, start to break dormancy and start to actively grow. And unfortunately, if those forages have been subjected to drought and poor management previously, and then there's a lot of competition from those cool season forages, it can really delay their recovery, or the speed of which they might recover from a drought or other stressors. So managing those cool season forages is critical. Uncontrolled weed problems. I've had a lot of phone calls this spring about cool season annual weeds, and I was talking to an agent the other day, and they even said, I feel like I see a lot more, Texas groundsel and a lot of our common cool season annual weeds this year. And that's likely because we really abused our warm season perennial forages last year with drought and lack of fertility and likely overgrazing those forages. And so there wasn't a lot to compete. And then a lot of folks were concerned about, lack of rainfall and utilizing cool season forages. And our cool season forages were later in productivity because of weather patterns. And that one time when we had sub-freezing temperatures, that really delayed our cool season forages, and they can provide some competition against a lot of those weeds. And so there's a lot of factors that influence each other and can influence those weed populations. But those weed populations can outcompete our desired forages, can utilize nutrients that we would prefer to be utilized by our desired forages, take advantage of moisture, sunlight, what have you. So weeds can also become a challenge. And I think I'll have a picture of a very common weed in Central and East Texas that is in my opinion is an indicator of poor management. And we'll talk about that more. Poor fertility, not maintaining the appropriate soil pH for that desired forage. Unfortunately, with high fertilizer prices, many of us had to make decisions based on economics this past year. And even though fertilizer prices have softened, nobody has a crystal ball in regards to what they're going to do for us, or what we're going to see this summer. And so soil fertility can also greatly influence not only the production, but also the persistence of our forages. So maintaining appropriate soil fertility will be critical to maintain those stands, especially in regards to persistence as well as productivity. Of course, drought, weather patterns, weather can influence the persistence of our forages, and lack of moisture is going to have a big impact. But it ultimately becomes a combination of a lot of these suspects that can lead to a decline or a loss of stand potentially. Grazing management, if our forages are overgrazed, as we remove that top growth, we also remove that root structure. And in order to produce leaves, we need roots, and in order to produce roots, we need leaves. And so grazing management is critical in regards to, maintaining the persistence, maintaining of that stand. And if a pasture is overgrazed and we have a drought, it takes longer for that pasture to recover from drought. And then if we have the combination of lack of fertility, overgrazed, and drought, that's a big challenge for those plants to be able to recover from any of that, because it needs nutrients in order to rebuild that root structure, and to produce additional leaves. And without those nutrients, it takes substantially longer, and it may not even be achieved. Disease could potentially be a problem. It's not very common in a lot of our warm season perennial forages for us in Texas. There are some diseases that we can see on Bermudagrass, but they are primarily a result of weather and then lack of nutrients. So once again, it becomes a culmination of factors that influence or that lead to an issue within our warm season perennial stands. Herbicide injury, I see very little of that, or very rarely. Most issues in regards to, or most reasons for Bermudagrass decline or decrease in production is a combination of other management, such as fertility, grazing, weed control, weather, that ultimately play into that impact the persistence of those stands. And then soil compaction, which is something that we don't I have not typically seen in East Texas, because in our perennial systems, we're not necessarily moving a lot of heavy equipment on a routine basis across our fields. And we'll talk about soil compaction and have some recommendations in regards to that. But that can also impact production. And so I'll address that first, and then we'll talk about some of the other factors that can impact decline or persistence of our warm season perennials. And then we'll talk about whether to replant or not and how to make those decisions. So soil compaction results most typically when you have heavy traffic, foot traffic, hoof traffic, or tire traffic, wheel traffic that compacts our soils. It decreases the amount of airspace that is within or between those soil particles where water and nutrients can move or filtrate through that environment. And so in my experience, it's most common to see soil compaction in heavier clay soils. If you've ever tried to compact sand or even sandy loam soils, it's a little bit more difficult compared to some clay, blackland clays, or even some red clay. That is something that if we have some moisture, it's fairly easily to form into a ball, and to kind of compact that and remove the air pockets and take the air pockets out of that. And so when we have compacted soils, it is difficult for roots to penetrate, to break through that compacted soil layer. And so those roots, even if they try to grow and extend, they're blocked by that compacted layer. And so they end up growing more laterally as opposed to vertically, and can end up, even though they may have a quote unquote long root system, because there's a compacted layer within that soil environment, they're not able to get, 24, 36 or 48 inches deep into the soil where there might be additional moisture or nutrients. They might end up ultimately being very shallow in our soils, where, of course, when we have dry conditions, that top 2 to 3 inches of our soil is what dries out first. And so even if you had a good root structure, if you have soil compaction, those plants would be impacted by drought and could be impacted by a lack of nutrient availability, even if those nutrients are deeper in that soil profile and available for that plant. So in my experience, in the 14 years that I've been in East Texas, I have not personally come across or seen soil compaction being a reason or a cause for a lack in forage production. I do think it occurs. In my understanding and experience, I think soil compaction is probably more common in our cropping systems, where they are, rotating crops from season to season. So there's a lot of plowing and disking and dragging and heavy equipment for planting and harvesting, and then replanting and harvesting. But it is possible. It could be possible in a hay production system, especially where your wheel path, you're making the same wheel path from year to year and season to season and harvest to harvest. So in some of those tighter soils, it's often recommended that you rotate your wheel path, that you're not going the same direction every time or following the same wheel path every time you traverse your property. If you're concerned or you think soil compaction might be a problem, I've heard a good recommendation from a soil scientist, or Dr. Jake Maurer, our soil extension specialist at College Station. An easy way to determine would be to take a piece of rebar and find, go out in the middle of your field where you do have traffic, whether it's wheel traffic or hoof traffic, drive that piece of rebar, see how far into the soil you can drive that piece of rebar. When you have good soil conditions, maybe when you have some moisture, not when it's as hard as a brick. And then along the fence row or along the fence where you're obviously don't have any hoof traffic or foot traffic or wheel traffic, drive that same piece of rebar and see if you can drive it to a greater depth at that location versus, say, the center of your field where there's traffic. So that could be a means to determine whether or not you have soil compaction. To alleviate soil compaction, it is typically subsoil compaction. So it's not just the top 1 to 2 inches or even top 6 inches that are compacted. It's usually at minimal 12 inches in depth or possibly deeper in regards to that layer that is compacted. So a light disking or disking is not going to be sufficient to break up any type of soil compaction, nor is something like aeration, which is a very common practice in East Texas, is using an airway, an air king, an aerator, whether it's spikes or what have you, to kind of disturb that soil during the dormant season. And that is not going to break up soil compaction because those spikes are typically no more than maybe 2 to 3 inches in depth or in length. So it's impossible for them to potentially break up something severe or something like soil compaction that is much deeper. So this is a picture courtesy of Dr. Vince Habe showing some hog damage, but I did want to talk about, and I borrowed this primarily or using this primarily because of the disc, because usually in January and February, I get a lot of questions about disking Bermudagrass pastures or hay meadows, whether that should be done or using an aerator, because most people think when we say renovation that it means disking or aerating our soils in order to improve our forage systems. So there's a time and a place for some of these implements. A couple of things we need to keep in mind. If you are disking your pastures or hay meadows, it is recommended that you do that during the dormant season when your warm season perennials are not actively growing. And also during the dormant season, during that January, February time period, we do tend to have more moisture rainfall. Because we have to keep in mind when we are disking or aerating, we are opening up that soil, we're exposing that soil to potentially dry out if we don't have good soil moisture. And that can impact our forage systems, could dry them out more. We also need to keep in mind, anytime we disturb the soil, we are potentially promoting seed germination. So our annual seeds, whether it's crabgrass, whether it's a grass or a weed, such as buttercup or goat weeds, those annual seeds are very shallow in our soils, and a lot of them will germinate upon soil disturbance. And then if there's good soil moisture, that can promote their germination as well. So if you are using disking or an aerator or a cultipacker or what have you to try to either increase infiltration to take advantage of some moisture or to repair hog damage. If you're doing it to repair hog damage, at the dormant season when we have good moisture is the ideal time. You just need to keep in mind that in that process, you could be promoting some seed germination of some undesired vegetation. So you'll need to be prepared for some weed control. So for a lot of us, we're doing these things to repair hog damage, but a lot of folks have the misconception that by disking or aerating their warm season perennials during the dormant season, they're going to increase their forage production. Dr. Gerald Evers did some research historically on whether or not disking during the dormant season increased forage production. And based on some research that he did over 3 years looking at fall treatment, so this was during the fall when we would be preparing or planting our cool season forages. So he looked at how disking of 1 to 2 inch disking, which is recommended for overseeding ryegrass or legumes, and then planting those forage species, how that influenced Bermuda grass production. And disking decreased that first hay harvest that following year for that Bermuda grass. So a lot of people think that disking promotes production. So disking will promote tillering. It does cut those tillers, those rhizomes and stolons that are moving above and below the soil surface of Bermuda grass, but it doesn't increase production. So it's not a Band-Aid that's going to fix a bigger problem. So when you think about disking or using an implement, really think about why. What are your goals with that process? Is it actually going to provide or lead to the goals, or are you potentially wasting some resources and creating some other issues, such as increasing some weed populations? Now, I understand for repairing hog damage, we do have to use a lot of these implements in order to try to level our soils back out so we don't lose our teeth when we're baling hay or mowing hay, or even trying to spray for weeds in a pasture. So just a few things to think about. Renovation does not always mean that we need to pull out a piece of equipment in order to improve our forage production or the persistence of our forages. But if you do have soil compaction, that is going to require mechanical means to repair that, to break up that soil compaction. But something as shallow as a disc or an aerator is not going to break up that soil compaction. So it's always important, if you think you have soil compaction, is to confirm whether or not you do in fact have soil compaction, and then use or borrow the appropriate tool in order to repair that soil compaction. So in order to repair soil compaction, one of the recommendations is a paratill plow. So you can plow up that entire field, obviously creating a lot of damage and really, damaging that warm season perennial side, taking out a lot of that forage and resulting in the need to replant. There is an implement called a paratill plow that basically drives those shanks below the down into the subsoil, where it breaks up that soil compaction and leaving minimal damage to the forage above and on the soil surface and to that perennial side. However, this equipment can be very expensive, and it also can take a very long time, because obviously you're dragging that through the subsoil. So it can take a very heavy piece of equipment, additional weights potentially to keep it in that subsoil location, and then a lower speed to drag it through. So it is a very arduous task. So always confirm that you have soil compaction before you really invest in this process of using plowing, completely taking a chisel plow and completely plowing up that entire piece of property, or even using a paratill plow to break up that subsoil compaction. So that's going to be greatly impacted on your location and then your traffic and your soil type. So by definition, renovate is to quote unquote make something new again, is to improve it, bring it back to life, what have you. Some of those possible goals might just be to improve yield and the quality of forage that is being produced, to reduce weed competition or to suppress weed competition, hopefully to minimize soil erosion, to maintain good cover, to maintain a dense side so you can reduce or correct soil erosion. And then it might be also to enhance wildlife habitat or even for beautification. So two possible approaches. One might be to completely replant entirely. Now, whether or not you replant, of course, that is the big question, and that is going to come down oftentimes to a personal decision. And how I recommend approaching whether to replant or not is to define your farm goals. What do you want to achieve moving forward? Are you going to stay in livestock production and cow-calf production or stockers? Are you going to want to retain animals or increase your herd again? Or are you in hay production or a combination of livestock and hay production? Or do you just want to support wildlife? So it's going to depend on your personal goals, and those goals may change over time. Again, as a result, a lot of people's goals will change as a result to years where fertilizer prices are high, or understanding our risk for drought conditions. So you have to look at your goals. The current forage system may not fit your particular goals, so it may be advantageous to replant entirely if a different forage system is better suited for your particular goals. So I've seen a common mixed reviews or mixed recommendations in regards to at what point you should replant. Some say that when you have less than 20% of a stand, which is very little forage in my opinion. And then some say less than 40%. So it can come down to specifically what your scenario is, what is your density of desired forage, what is the density of that population, and then what is the density of undesired species, whether it's weeds or brush. I would definitely say if your weed population is greater than your forage population, it is probably advantageous to replant, to reestablish, because if you think about what that system, that pasture hay meadow would look like once you remove all of those weeds, you know, if you have a greater weed population than a forage population, then you're going to have a lot of bare ground. And so that means introducing additional sprigs or seeds. And so at that point, it might be easier to kill all existing vegetation and to start over. Another possible approach might be just to fill in some of those blank places, those spaces, is to control any weed populations, improve soil fertility or soil pH for the desired species, and then add additional seed or additional sprigs to fill in, especially if you're concerned about that Bermudagrass or Bahiagrass filling in by itself. If those forages are stressed from lack of fertility and drought, it's going to take them time to recover, to be productive, for that individual plant itself, much less to try to fill in blank spaces or open areas. And when I was talking about those annual weed seeds, if we have been dry and we get some moisture, the first thing to respond is going to be those annual seeds. Depending on the severity of the stress on that warm season perennial, it may not respond. It may not necessarily respond very quickly to moisture. It's going to need nutrients and moisture in regards to respond or to expedite its response. And for a lot of us, lack of fertility last year is going to slow that response of that warm season perennial as we get moisture, as we've had moisture. So it takes a combination of things. So one of the first places to start, no matter what, as you look to 2023, as you try to make decisions, and I've had this conversation with a lot of folks have already done this, is soil testing. If you have not already collected a soil sample for this season, I highly recommend that you do that. We've had some good moisture, some good soil moisture. It should be fairly easy to collect some samples. If we have a weekend where it doesn't rain and we've had some nice weather, some sunny days, some warm temperatures, so it's not too bad in regards to getting out and collecting some samples. Starting with a soil analysis is really the only way to move forward in regards to making decisions about fertilizer and being efficient with your fertilizer choices. And hopefully a lot of people have learned that as a result of high fertilizer prices. But even when fertilizer prices are cheap or decent, which who knows, if I'm confident they'll never be cheap again, but no matter what their price is, we should never make fertilizer decisions without a soil test. So in a pasture system, I recommend every 2 to 3 years. You may even be able to do that every 5 years. As long as you are kind of following some basic management as far as trying to maintain that stand, because in a pasture system, we're recycling those nutrients through grazing. Our livestock consume those nutrients and they're returning 70 to 90% of those nutrients back into that system through their feces and urine. So we're recycling those nutrients in that grazing system. In a hay production system, you absolutely need to be collecting soil samples on a yearly basis because you are harvesting those nutrients, you're selling them to your neighbor, you're storing them in a barn to feed to your livestock later. You're not recycling those nutrients directly back into that field. So you should definitely be collecting soil samples on a yearly basis. Those samples should be sent to College Station. Our soil forage water testing lab is in College Station. You can download the forms from the soil testing website, which is soiltesting.tamu.edu. We can drop that in the chat, that website in the chat. You can also get forms and bags from your county extension office. They are free. You personally need to collect those samples and send those directly yourself to College Station. The directions are on the bags as well as the form on how to send those to College Station. Keep in mind, the later you wait to do that, the closer we get to our actual warm season, our Bermudagrass season, more folks are going to be doing that and are going to be sending in those samples, and it's going to take longer to get your results. One recommendation as we are recovering from drought is to select minimum requirement on that analysis or that request on that test. That is also often a recommendation for establishment because by selecting that minimum requirement or letting them know that you are establishing that season, that you are going to be planting new sprigs or new seeds, they will focus, the lab will focus on things like phosphorus and potassium, which are important for root growth and development and persistence. When we are trying to recover from drought, from a lot of stress, or we are planting new grass, new Bermudagrass or Bahiagrass, we don't necessarily need a lot of nitrogen, not high levels or not high rates of nitrogen as those grasses are starting to get established or recover from drought or extremely stressful situations. So pay attention to that on your information as you are submitting that. Your soil test, this is just an image of what a routine soil analysis will report back in regards to your soil pH, your primary nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, some secondary nutrients, and then specific recommendations on how to apply those nutrients if they need to be split across multiple applications, if there's any specific recommendations based on those nutrients and how to be efficient with those applications. Now, a lot of folks get overwhelmed with the fact that they're reporting the units in parts per million because I don't know about you, but I don't think in parts per million. Whenever I think about fertilizer, applying fertilizer, I think in pounds per acre. So to make it easier for yourself to possibly kind of understand what this analysis is telling you, you can multiply that parts per million by 2, and that will give you pounds per acre. So where it says nitrate, nitrogen, it says 21 parts per million. So if we multiply that by 2, that means there are 42 pounds per acre of nitrate, nitrogen available in that pasture, that hay meadow, based on that soil sample. So, something else to remember is to produce a ton of coastal Bermudagrass, we need 50 pounds of nitrogen, 14 pounds of phosphorus, and 42 pounds of potassium. So by remembering 50, 14, and 42, and then multiplying that parts per million by 2, that can help you see, okay, so 42 pounds of nitrogen per acre is not going to produce a ton of Bermudagrass. So if I want more Bermudagrass, I'm going to need to apply some nitrogen. And the lab is going to give you recommendations based on optimum production, what's going to be effective and meet your goals. Obviously, you have to tell them what you're trying to achieve. And then following those soil test recommendations to the best of your ability to optimize production and persistence. And persistence, in my opinion, is probably more often overlooked compared to production. So most of us understand why nitrogen is important, that it's going to increase yield and have a direct impact on crude protein content and for our grasses, for our forage. So often phosphorus and potassium are overlooked, and at times both of those nutrients have been more expensive than nitrogen, so they're often left off because we see an impact of nitrogen. You apply nitrogen, you get rainfall, that Bermudagrass practically jumps out of the ground. So often people don't think or understand why phosphorus and potassium are important, Phosphorus is important for root growth and development. So as we're trying to recover from drought, that's going to be very important. Or as those forages are trying to recover from being overgrazed, where we've removed a lot of top growth, and as a result, a lot of that root structure has died back. It's important to rebuild that root structure. Root growth and development will also be critical as if we are trying to establish from sprigs or from seed. Obviously, root growth and development is part of that establishment process. So phosphorus is critical for that. So we don't necessarily need a lot of phosphorus for Bermudagrass production or even Bahiagrass production, but it can still be critical for root, like I said, for root growth and development. So overlooking that is not necessarily beneficial. So paying attention to that soil test can help us make the best decisions in regards to, do we need phosphorus? If we do, how much do we need, as opposed to just not applying any at all. Potassium, I like to say potassium is for persistence. It's very critical for the persistence of Bermudagrass, especially in our sandy soils of East Texas. Our sand is naturally deficient in potassium, has a lower cation exchange capacity, so that our sandy soils do not hold on to potassium. So in East Texas, in my experience, a lot of decline is a result of potassium deficiency, no matter the weather patterns or the weather conditions. So I have seen potassium deficiencies lead to Bermudagrass decline even during good growing conditions. And it's very common in East Texas in our sandy soils that are naturally deficient in potassium. So paying attention to potassium will be critical. And that, unfortunately, was also a nutrient that was overlooked, seeing as it was at times over $1,000 a ton this past year. So I anticipate a lot of our decline or reduced production in Bermudagrass is going to be a result of a potassium deficiency, along with drought and along with overgrazing, most likely this past year. One thing we do need to keep in mind with Bermudagrass and potassium is that Bermudagrass can be a luxury consumer of potassium. So if your soil test recommendation recommends more than 75 pounds of potassium per acre, you will see at the bottom of that recommendation that you split that potassium. So if we go back to this particular soil analysis, the recommendation is 120 pounds per acre. If you look at the bottom, kind of in small print, it says on potassium, split apply potassium fertilizer if recommendation is more than 75 pounds of K2O per acre. So that is because Bermudagrass can be a luxury consumer. If this producer went out in May or June and applied that 120 pounds of K2O per acre of potassium per acre, by the end of the season, they could be suffering from, they could see Bermudagrass decline because of a lack of potassium or deficiency in potassium, even though they followed that recommendation. And that's because that Bermudagrass will use all of that potassium. And so we need to split apply that application when we need more than 75 pounds. And I also recommend in East Texas or in sandy soils in our state, where we do tend to be deficient in potassium, between hay cuttings, as we are applying nitrogen, we should also be applying potassium because that ton of Bermudagrass needs 42 pounds of potassium. So almost as much potassium as we need nitrogen. So I anticipate seeing a lot of potassium deficiencies as we move into 2023. I also have seen and anticipate to continue to see a greater density of this particular grassy weed. This is broom sedge bluestem. It is a warm season perennial grassy weed. It's often not noticed until our Bermudagrass or our warm season perennials have gone dormant. And you can see that picture on the right, kind of in a winter time picture, where warm season perennials have gone dormant, and that broom sedge bluestem, a bunch type grass, and it is still standing there. It is dormant, but it looks like you could collect it and turn it into a broom. And so at that point, it's much more noticeable. It's taller than the Bermudagrass or Bahiagrass at that point, and it's more obvious when you're just driving by a field. But broom sedge bluestem in and of itself is not very competitive. So we don't see a lot of this in a well-managed stand where we have not overgrazed, we have maintained soil fertility, and we have managed our desirable forage. If we are managing our desirable forage, we're going to see less competition from undesirable forage weed species such as broom sedge bluestem. Where I see broom sedge bluestem is is when we have started to neglect and poorly managed our pastures or hay meadows, or on property that just has not been managed for years, whether it's held up in an estate or in between owners. So I've seen a perfectly beautiful coastal Bermuda grass field over time slowly transition to where it's predominantly Bahiagrass, which is a viable forage. And then with continued neglect and lack of care, it was continued to be harvested, but no inputs, no weed control was managed. But it was continually harvested from year to year. That field has slowly become predominantly broom sedge bluestem because there is no desirable forage there to outcompete, because those forages don't have the nutrients or the appropriate soil pH for them to outcompete or to even try to outcompete anything like broom sedge bluestem. And unfortunately, the only thing to control broom sedge bluestem is Roundup, which has the active ingredient glyphosate. There are no other selective herbicides that will control broom sedge bluestem in another grass. So if you have broom sedge bluestem, one of my first recommendations is soil testing and then weed control, using Roundup to reduce the population of that broom sedge. But it's also going to take improving your management on that warm season perennial. Now, if it has become like this particular field that I was talking about, where that broom sedge bluestem is your predominant species, then that might be a time of which where you go in, kill all existing vegetation, do a soil test, improve that nutrient status with phosphorus, potassium, and potentially some lime here in East Texas if our soil pH is too low, and replant, and then promote that desired forage, whether it's Bermudagrass or Bahiagrass. So those something to think about. So following drought, this can be something else to think about in regards to whether we try to replant or not, is can our forage system recover from the drought and our poor management, or how long would it take for it to recover, and how immediately do I need a forage system? Now, we do have to keep in mind that our warm season perennials, Bahiagrass or Bermudagrass, if we plant those this spring, that doesn't necessarily mean we're able to use that forage or that pasture or that hay meadow during that season. We're often very lucky on Bermudagrass if we're able to harvest or to graze that pasture or hay meadow at the earliest might be in the fall, and that's going to be greatly dependent on weather and our weather this summer as far as heat and moisture. So, we have been receiving some good moisture lately. But our continued moisture during the establishment season will greatly influence how quickly that species can establish. And that will also impact recovery as our forages are trying to recover from drought. But rain may not be the only thing that we need in order for our warm season perennials to recover from drought. They'll likely need some nutrients to promote that root growth and development as well, and to promote that persistence. So for some of our systems, they may recover quicker if we retained a higher stubble height. As a result of retaining a higher stubble height, we likely also retained a better root structure. Those systems will recover faster than those of which that we've grazed down to the soil level, because we have to keep in mind, leaves produce roots and roots produce leaves, and if we have grazed that top growth down to the soil level, we've greatly reduced that root structure below the soil surface. And so it takes time for that root structure to rebuild. And in order to do so, it needs leaf area, and that leaf needs roots in order to produce leaves. So it will depend on so many factors as far as to whether or not that your system will recover or how quickly it will recover. So it may take a full season for some of our fields to actually recover, along with some improved management, such as weed control and fertility, to really promote those desired forages. So if you need to replant, some recommendations. We always need to start with a clean seed bed. So you'll have to kill all existing vegetation. I typically recommend starting that process in the fall. Killing all existing vegetation with 5 to 6 quarts of Roundup or glyphosate to kill all existing vegetation, create a well-prepared seed bed, and instead of letting that land lay fallow all winter, we can come in with a cool season annual. So ryegrass or a small grain, and then we can still use that part of our property for the winter, but for grazing or even for harvesting. Doing that gives us two opportunities to really have an impact on weed pressure for that establishment season. Now, if we haven't started that process until now, we can still start that process, but we have to kill all existing vegetation, 5 to 6 quarts per acre, create that well-prepared seed bed, and then we can sprig or we can plant seeds. Now, the timing of year to do that, or in the spring, summer, we can plant Bermudagrass or Bahiagrass anytime between typically April, May on into before our first frost. Now, ideally, we'll have greater success if we plant those seeds and sprigs in the spring, and hopefully with spring moisture, start that establishment process instead of trying to plant in the dead of summer when our temperatures are even in the 90s at night or triple digits during the day, and when we likely have dry conditions or drought. Planting in the fall could be an option, but we would like to have better establishment, a good root system before we go into a winter. Now, our winters are not necessarily always that severe, but we had a night this year, or last year, I should say, I think it was in November or December, where we were below freezing, in the 20s. And then we had that snowpocalypse a couple of years ago where a lot of us had snow and ice. The entire state had snow and ice and sub-zero temperatures for a period. So not knowing what our winter will be, in my opinion, it is best to establish these warm season perennials in that late spring, early summer time period. Now, sprigs, when you plant sprigs, will depend on when those sprigs are available. So a lot of people that dig sprigs or sell sprigs are not going to start digging sprigs until their Bermudagrass has broken dormancy and they have started to actively grow. Now, this is the very confusing part because most people think that when Bermudagrass is green, that it's actively growing. Well, our Bermudagrass can break dormancy in February, but still not actively start growing until May or June. So Bermudagrass starts actively growing when our nighttime temperatures are in the 60s Fahrenheit consistently. And even though right now we might get up to 80 during the day, our nighttime temperatures are still in the 50s. When I look at the 10-day forecast, we don't break 60 at night at all in the next couple of days. So even if our Bermudagrass is green, it's not necessarily actively growing. So we need to be flexible with that time as far as when those sprigs might be dug and when we might be able to plant those. Seeds are not going to germinate until those temperatures as well. So we could potentially plant them a little bit earlier than maybe planting sprigs if we're not going to be subject to another frost potentially. So we do have some options. Now, a lot of people question or ask about dormant sprigs. If you're going to plant dormant sprigs, I only recommend coastal Bermudagrass in regards to planting dormant sprigs. So that would be planting material that is dormant. And right now, nothing is our warm season perennials are not dormant. They're just not actively growing. Some of our warm season perennials, Bermudagrasses, jigs can be planted by tops. Other people have had success with planting coastal, basically kind of by tops, harvesting coastal Bermudagrass when it's fairly tall, and then, baling it when it's green and immediately basically unrolling that and disking that into a well-prepared seed bed. So that could potentially be achieved if you have good soil moisture. So that could be another option for coastal Bermudagrass as well. So I do have, here's kind of a quick breakdown of recommendations on how to establish, how to plant. There are some good publications on my Forage Facts website on the establishment process for warm season perennials by sprigs, publication on seeded Bermudagrass, as well as on Bahiagrass. There are some pros and cons to what we might plant. First and foremost, you need to select something that's adapted to your location and that fits within your forage system goals. So just because your neighbor has coastal Bermuda grass doesn't mean that that fits your forage system and your goals. So keep that in mind. So if you have questions on what's adapted or what might be recommended for your goals or your location, you can reach out to your county extension agent. I'm happy to give some suggestions or recommendations. I get questions quite frequently. And keep in mind, just because you hear about a forage in a popular press article, it may not be adapted to Texas. So if you're not familiar with a species or a variety, please ask someone, your county extension agent or myself, and we can give you recommendations on whether or not that species would work for you and for your location in our state. Some of our species and even varieties can be very site specific. And so we want to make sure it's well adapted to your location and then your anticipated management, how you're going to manage that as you move forward. So as we kind of sum up tonight and as I address some questions, you're happy to answer any questions. Renovation does not always mean that you need to replant. It may simply mean that we need to do a soil test, reevaluate our management, do some weed control, apply fertilize, apply some lime to promote that desired forage. And it may not even necessarily mean we need to use a piece of equipment such as a disc or a plow to improve that forage production system. For a lot of us, it just means reevaluating our management and improving those or making different decisions. Now, you might be in a situation where you do need to replant. I'm happy to help in regards to making suggestions, giving some information or directions, and your county extension agents can also be very helpful resources in regards to moving forward with that process. And there's some great publications on Forage Facts that can help with part of that process. Probably one of the biggest challenges of establishment is weed control. There's a publication on Forage Facts about herbicides or weed control for newly sprigged Bermuda grass. Luckily or unluckily, I don't know which, luckily, I guess, our sprig Bermuda grass, we tend to have more weed control options than seeded Bermuda grass. Because when we plant seeds, all of those seeds don't germinate at the same time. And a lot of our herbicides can impact seed germination. But there are some things to keep in mind. Herbicides, as well as herbicides that we have previously used, recently used, can also influence our establishment. So ask those questions, get that information from myself or your county extension agent before you start planting to make sure that you will be successful, because we want you to be successful. It can be an expensive endeavor. I will tell you, a common question is, what's more expensive, planting seed or sprigs? Well, it can vary from season to season. It depends on seed availability and other costs that influence the cost of seed. Our Bermuda grass seed comes out of California. Most of our Bahiagrass seed comes out of Florida. So their weather from previous seasons can greatly influence availability of that seed. And then trucking or train, rail or trucking costs can influence cost of that seed as well, since it's having to be moved. So a lot of factors can influence it. There have actually been years where it was cheaper to sprig versus planting seed. I do have a list of spriggers or sprig suppliers in Central and East Texas. If anybody is looking for a source of sprigs or someone who could sprig for them, I'm happy to provide that list. I have contact names, phone numbers, the counties that they are located in, and the varieties that they grow or that they sell or they sprig. I'm happy to share that. I do not post it on Forage Facts because of personal information, but I am happy to share that with you directly. And if you sell sprigs or are a sprigger and you would like to be added to that list, please let me know. I'm happy to do that if you are okay with your information being shared. So at this time, I'll be happy to answer any questions. Just keep in mind, first step as we move forward into 2023 is to start with a soil test. That's the cheapest thing you can do. Routine soil analysis costs you $12. And in my opinion, that it can save us a lot of money, using that as a tool to make decisions as we move forward. My Forage Facts website Shaniqua has shared that link in the chat, along with some other helpful links for the YouTube channel where you can find previous recordings, as well as the soil testing lab for forms and additional information for the Soil Forage Water Testing Lab at College Station. And this is the Forage Facts website. They're excellent publications, and I do post an article. You can subscribe via email. I do post an article every week. I do try to make them timely and pertinent to the current situation, whether that's drought or time of year, things we need to be thinking about, evaluating as we move forward into the next season. So with that, I will be happy to answer any questions that anyone might have. You're welcome to unmute if you would like, or you can drop those questions in the chat. But thank you for joining us this evening. I will have to check real quick as to when our next, unless Shaniqua remembers when our next Ag in the Evening program is, but I will work on that. If anybody has any questions, you can start directing those.